Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, first, I must apologize in reference to no video, no content. Yesterday, I had a medical appointment, a dental appointment to be more specific, and was just not in a condition to make a video. But today we are feeling much better. I have a fresh cup of the former state of Ethiopian coffee. Very good coffee. Must take a sip here real quick. Very good coffee. If you can get yourself a cup of former Ethiopian state coffee, very good coffee. Now, first I want to talk about history. I want to have a look back. I want to have a look back at World War II. Specifically, I want to look at the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, June 22nd, 1941, I believe. Operation Barbarossa. Now, if we look at the first 6 months of the conflict, you would have to say, well, as a viewer, as an analyst, you'd have to say that it was a German success. At the start of the conflict, the Germans had amassed just under 4 million Axis forces, which included over 3,000 tanks, 3,000 other armored vehicles, 2,000 to 5,000 aircraft, and 7 to possibly up to 20,000 pieces of artillery, 600,000 horses, and 600,000 vehicles. The Soviets, the Russians, frontline strength was about 2.6 to 2.9 million personnel. And what the Germans were not aware of was the sheer size and scope of Soviet tank deployment. Over 11,000 tanks, along with 9,000 military aircraft. So in the first 6 months, in which we observed the Germans get within sight of Moscow, the casualty rates for the Soviets was over 500,000 KIA. Another 250,000 died of non-combat causes, diseases, various other issues that happen on the battlefield. Over 1.3 million wounded. And then another 2.3 million captured. Now think about that for this. In the first 6 months of the war, 2.3 million Soviets, Russians captured. 566,000 KIA, 1.3 million wounded, both non-combat and combat causes. And again, within sight of Moscow. The Germans, for their losses, lost 186,000 killed and 655,000 wounded. And that was a tremendous cost, as it was some very high-performing German units that took casualties over that first 6-month period. That was one of the key metrics that eventually caused the Germans to lose the war, losing those very valuable German units, German soldiers, over the course of that 6 months. Now, obviously, the war went on for some years, and we know what things then look like going into 44 and 45. The Russian army, the Soviet army had transformed itself and looked quite a bit different. Now, within the confines of this conflict, the Ukrainians, with its Western backers, the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, other non-governmental organizations, such as George Soros' group and other groups as well, against the Russians. Have we seen the Russians transform into a command economy yet, like what occurred during World War II? No, we have not. Are we seeing signs that the Russians could transform into a command economy, meaning the economy is built to facilitate military operations? Possibly. Now, by no means have we seen that occur yet. What we have seen is an uptick in Russian military production and mobilization in order to win the war. We have seen specifically an uptick in Russian tank production, Russian armored vehicles, and more importantly, for the Russians, we are seeing the Russian doctrine change. We are seeing very much the Russians start to pay attention to its air force and its drone capability. We are starting to see the Russians deploy new systems that we have not seen before. Systems that going into this conflict, the Russians were not actively fielding, deploying in large numbers. It wasn't what the Russians did. Now, with the experience over the course of the last year, we're starting to see the Russians change, adapt. We can see that in the deployment of some of the drone systems, i.e. the Lancet series of drones, but we're also seeing other drone systems start to be observed over the skies of Ukraine in Novorossiya. We're starting to see that. That is happening. We're starting to see new weapon systems being deployed. And again, at the same time, essentially what the Russians produced in all of 2022, the Russians are now producing that amount of equipment in just a 30-day period. So they have started to ramp up production in a very large way. And that's starting to take an effect on the battlefield. Whereas the Ukrainians did seek success in repelling Russian operations, especially in Kiev, and then we saw later success east of the Dnieper River, especially east of Kharkov. And then obviously the Russians withdrew from Kherson. But the Russians have, for all intents and purposes, drawn a line in the sand in areas that it currently controls, and are actively pursuing offensive operations in areas such as Kupiansk. We don't know if this is accurate at this point. This area we're looking at right now, with the area of this green color and this orangish red to the east. We do know that the Russian offensive continues near Kupiansk. We are seeing Russian tank formations, Russian infantry formations, and more importantly, we're seeing continued Russian aviation bombing and striking Ukrainian targets. Over the last few days, we have seen additional deep penetration strikes by Russian forces against a variety of Ukrainian targets, including the Ukrainian surface warfare capacity with those low observable boats that had caused the Russians some troubles in attacking multiple Russian ships. And we've seen the Russians go after the production capability of those small, low observable drone surface vessels. And we've seen other strikes throughout Ukraine. And again, it's very difficult to ascertain the success of those strikes because the Ukrainians do not report casualty figures. They only report civilian casualties. They do not report the casualties of military personnel. And we believe at this point those casualty rates are increasing at a very, very high rate because of ongoing Russian operations and ongoing Ukrainian operations as well, such as seen in the counteroffensive between Zaporizhzhia and Volhodar. That operation continues, albeit a bit slower, a bit more focused, and not as broad and expansive with multiple brigades, dozens of brigades being deployed against Russian forces. The Ukrainians took a beating going from early June onwards, and now are reassessing what they are doing in this area because of those high casualty rates. We're also getting word that Ukrainian morale in its combat units is starting to wane. Many of these units, the esprit de corps that we observed early in earlier campaigns, is not the same in the Ukrainian army as it is now. That has changed. We've also seen quite a few Ukrainians, millions of Ukrainians, attempt to leave Ukraine, and also a lot of fighting age males attempting to avoid draft obligations and conscript obligations. They don't want to serve because of the high casualty rates. You can not announce casualty rates, but because of local funerals and word of mouth, people understand what's happening on the front line. And they know in Ukraine that if you join the military and you go serve with a line brigade, there is a high probability you are going to die or be seriously wounded. And that's what is happening. And I would say at this point, it's not just what's happening on the Ukrainian side, it's also happening on the Russian side as well, especially for those individuals who are war adverse, who do not want to serve in one's country for whatever purposes. You see that. And it's just not indicative, obviously, of Ukraine, Russia. It's the same here in the United States and other nation states as well. The lambs and the wolves separate in times of national strife. And that's what's happening. But again, not a lot of major territorial changes to speak of. The Russians continue operations north in Kupiansk. We're also seeing, again, as we talked about before, that uptick of air operations by the Russians. That is continuing and methodically continuing to blast away at Ukrainian targets. And the Ukrainians are taking significant casualties by the Russian Air Force, drones, long-range artillery, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, what have you. It is absolutely taking a toll on Ukrainian forces, and not just frontline forces, but rear area forces as well, to include foreign volunteer fighters or possibly covert foreign operations elements that are in the country assisting the Ukrainians. And I think at some point we'll find out more about that and what exactly that looks like. But for right now, it's very much covert. So that's where we set for today. Again, thank you for joining us as always. We will continue to cover the war. We will continue to cover the war without bias and bring you facts and information that you need. Have a good day.